So continuing on with Chapter 6, Bones and Skeletal Tissue Part 2, we're going to start with Section 6.5. So when we're looking at Section 6.5, there's a new term we're going to talk about, which is going to be called ossification. And ossification is going to be the process of bone formation. You may also see the term osteogenesis, which essentially means the same thing, but these two terms are synonymous for this whole process of bone tissue formation. So what's interesting about this bone tissue formation is when we have this bony skeleton that's going to form, it's going to form around month 2 of development. So that is when we're going to start this process. So as we go with this forming skeleton, we are talking about in utero. So the formation of the bony skeleton is what it's called. So as a reminder, what we said at the very, very beginning was that the skeleton is not hardened cartilage, but that cartilage is converted and transferred into, replaced by bone. So we're going to start with this process. So you'll hear cartilage and bony skeleton quite a few times. So this will actually occur at week 8. So up to week 8, the fetal skeleton is going to be made up of cartilage. So up until fetal skeleton is going to be made up of cartilage, and then at this particular process, it will be replaced with bone. So the process that does this, where it's going to be replaced with bone, is going to be endochondral ossification. So with endochondral ossification, we are replacing our bone. Our bone is replacing our hyaline cartilage. And when this happens, there's going to be a series of bones that are going to be called something kind of different. It's going to be cartilage endochondral bones, because it's going to be a mixture of the two tissues. And this is going to occur for most of the skeleton. So this will be almost all your bones will go through this endochondral ossification. Where the intramembranous ossification is a different process, these bones are going to be called membranous bones, and this is primarily going to be for tissues that are going to be your skull, your clavicle, or your flat bones. So the bigger priority to really understand and know is this endochondral classification. So we're going to start with that. Endochondral, remember anything that is conj is going to say cartilage or connective tissue. So endochondral ossification. We are converting our cartilage to bone. So this is going to be essentially all bones, except for those clavicles, which will go through that other process. And it will begin at month 2. So this will begin around week 8 in month 2. So what it's going to do is it's going to replace hyaline cartilage specifically. And the way it will do that is through a very sequenced step process of about 4 to 5 steps. So as it's going to do this, it's going to start at the very middle, which is going to be called the primary ossification center, and it's going to be the center of the shaft. So as we're going through this process, we are starting there. So there are 5 main steps to the process of ossification. So this is a breakdown, a shorthand version, but I'm actually going to go down to the 5 steps in image form. So this is the picture of them. So we're going to talk through this. Endochondral ossification and a long bone. So when we said that the ossification center was going to be the center of the bone, essentially what we mean is if you have the bone where the diaphysis looks like this and the epiphyses looks like this, we're going to start around right here. This is going to be the primary ossification center. So this is where the process is going to start, is in the center of a long bone. So knowing that, we're going to go down to the next step. So with this, the first step is going to be starting at the bone collar. It's going to form around the diaphysis of the hyaline cartilage model. So we're going to start with this primary ossification center. So as a reminder, right now, this is actually going to be cartilage. So the structure is there. But what you're going to get is you're going to have, let me get a little color for you, a bone collar. So I'm going to do all of my bone as green. So a bone color will start to form around the diaphysis of the hyaline cartilage model. So this is going to be our bone collar. So what's happening with this bone collar is we are essentially going to start hardening from the middle, and then we're going to go outward. So what's going to happen in step 2 is with our bone collar, we now have our epiphyses, our diaphyses. We're starting to get this bone collar. You're going to actually next have the center of your diaphyses, the cartilage that will be in the middle, will start to calcify, and you will develop a cavity. So the space inside the middle will actually start to open up and develop this cavity. And it's going to start decaying around it in order to make a larger cavity. So we're going to start doing this, but remember we also have this bone collar that is around the outside of our bones. So then in step 3, what we're going to have is that we are going to have, here's our diaphysis, our epiphysis. We've got the inside that is starting to become a little bit more of a cavity. And what's happening here is something called a periosteal bud. So a periosteal bud is going to be made up of blood supply. It's going to have artery, vein, nerve tissue, and it's going to essentially be the incoming blood supply that will then go into and essentially invade the internal cavity. This will occur around month 3 is where you will have this process. So from the end of month 2 to the around month 3, you're going through steps 1 and 2. So now we've got our wider medullary in the middle. We've still got the bone collar around the outside, but we have this essentially new supply of nutrients and oxygen coming through the blood supply. So that's going to increase the growth. So if you're trying to remember the sequence of steps, you have to have the periosteal bud before you really convert everything to replace it with bone. Okay, so then the next step, what we're going to do with our endochondral ossification is we have our diaphysis, our epiphysis. It is all cartilage right now. We've got our medullary shaft in the middle that's been hollowing out this whole time, and we have our periosteal bud that is now in the middle of this. But what's happening in step 4, this has already kind of been here, you're going to have your diaphysis elongate. And as you elongate, it'll essentially start to cavity out or create a larger medullary cavity. So as this epiphysis or the diaphysis starts to elongate, what it will actually do is as it does that, it will convert it will break down the cartilage and replace it with bone. So your bone collar will get larger and actually do the entire diaphysis first. So as it's doing this, your osteoclasts are breaking down the cartilage and are essentially creating new spongy bone, and then surrounding it with compact bone. So as this is happening, when your epiphyses are still cartilage, but your diaphysis is going to be bone, is going to be the end of step 4. So this will happen from week 9 to birth. Is this process will happen. So when you're actually at birth, your epiphyses are still considered cartilage. So they are still going to be made up of a totally different type of tissue that needs to be replaced by bone. So at week 9, your epiphyses are cartilage, but your diaphysis, so the center, is going to be bone. So this is kind of what you'll get at week 9 all the way up through birth. And then when you actually, after you have birth, then you'll go through the final step, which is going to be step 5. And this is when your epiphyses will actually ossify. And ossify means they're going to be replaced by bone. So now at this point, if this is my bone, got my medullary cavity, this is where we were with replacing our bone, but now we have replaced the whole thing with our bone. We have a large medullary cavity. We have our periosteal bud that has turned into the artery and the vein completely, and your epiphyses have ossified. So this way you will have the entirety of your bone replaced into cartilage. This is going to happen at post-birth, and then as growth will occur, this step 5, will actually stay and continue from childhood to adolescence. But this process is different than bone growth in adolescence. This process is bone being replaced by a cartilage, from cartilage to a bone. So it's essentially you've made a mold of cartilage that now you are replacing by a bone. So this is a very important process, but these 5 steps do a very good job of explaining what's happening. Okay, when you actually have the other process, which was intramembranous ossification, remember this was really only going to be for some of the bones of the skull, which are these guys, and your clavicle. So the way this works is we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, this intramembranous ossification, but this is the summary of all of the events right here. So basically what's happening with intramembranous ossification is it is also starting with an ossification center, but it's not necessarily starting with cartilage. It's just going to be an ossification of cartilage tissue and cartilage cells. Then what they're going to do is those fibrous connective tissue and your osteoblasts are going to secrete an osteoid. So we're essentially just going to form the process we've already talked about. It does not go from a cartilage model to a bone structure. So we have our ossification center. It's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be made up of osteoblasts and our connective tissue. And then we've got our osteoclasts, which will then secrete all of that osteoid to surround it. And then what you'll have is you'll have an immature spongy and periosteum. So you're still going to have that input of the blood supply come in, but you're going to have this immature kind of spongy bone. And then finally, you will have the compact bone come alongside and surround all of that. So that is a slightly different process, but the global one to know is going to be the intramembranous ossification. Okay, so that's what happens when you are creating your bony skeleton for the first time. What's happening with growing actual bones during development? So this is going to be considered postnatal bone growth. So what's happening with this is long bones will grow lengthwise, but they will also increase in thickness. So there's going to be another type of growth that we'll talk about called appositional growth. And then bones will stop growing at some point during adolescence. They all stop at different places in time point in development. They stop different points for males versus females, but they do eventually stop. And if they don't, then there's an issue with hormones. But how do you actually have growth in your long bones? So this is also a kind of not 5-step process, but 5-area process. So this is going to be both in long bones. That's going to be postnatal. So what's going to happen here is this thing called the epiphyseal cartilage and the epiphyseal plate. So we briefly talked about when we said at the very beginning, here was our epiphyses, here was our diaphysis, and then in between where these two connected was something called an epiphyseal plate. So that is what we're talking about right here. This guy and this guy. This is your epiphyseal plate. This is where bone growth will occur. And what will happen is there is epiphyseal cartilage at the epiphyseal plate. So essentially the green line I drew is the cartilage. And what it's actually going to do is this cartilage or this plate will maintain its constant thickness, but you will actually develop and grow the bone and push this up. So then it will grow larger and your epiphyseal plate will grow higher, and then it'll essentially just push everything, making the long bone longer. So this will actually occur at both ends. It's not just one. So this is how you're going to get bone growth. It's essentially going to push the epiphyseal plate further away from the middle of the bone. So how does it do that? There are 5 zones to the epiphyseal plate. So as we're looking at this overall picture right here with these 5 zones, the first zone is going to be the resting or the quiescent zone, and the last zone is going to be the ossification zone. So with this resting zone, this is going to be the top of your plate, whereas this is going to be the bottom of your plate. So that means the resting or the quiescent zone is going to be closest to the epiphyses, whereas the ossification zone is going to be closest to the diaphysis itself. So that's what we want to talk about. So this resting zone right here is the area of cartilage that is on the epiphyseal side of the epiphyseal plate and is inactive. All of that means that is a lots of epiphyseal. Okay, I'm just going to draw one diaphysis and one epiphysis. If this is the top of my epiphyseal plate and this is the bottom of my epiphyseal plate, within this area, I am going to have zone, that is my resting zone, which is going to be the top. Then I'm going to have my proliferation zone. Then I'm going to have my hypertrophic. Then I'm going to have my calcification. And then this last zone right here is going to be my ossification. So what we mean with the resting zone is that it is on the epiphyseal side. So it's on this side of the epiphyseal plate. This side right here is the epiphyseal side. The other side is the diaphysis side, this one. So that's how you know which side of the plate you're on. It is not top and bottom, because if we were to continue down our bone and draw another epiphyses like there is for every long bone, it also has an epiphyseal plate. However, this is going to be flipped. So your diaphysis side is the one that is closest to the diaphysis. That's this one. So it's not top and bottom as much as it is the one towards the middle and the one towards out. So the resting zone is on the epiphyseal side. The next zone is going to be your proliferation and your growth zone. So this is exactly what the name says. This is where you will have rapid division. So it'll be constantly dividing in this proliferation zone. So the proliferation zone is important for rapid division. You're going to have a lot of cells dividing. Proliferation, that's exactly what that means. As these cells are dividing, they are going to push the epiphysis away from the diaphysis. So as they create new cells, they are going to push this up and away. As they form new ones, they're going to keep doing this. This will cause the lengthening of the bone. So the next zone is the hypertrophic zone. So this is where you're going to be slightly closer to the diaphysis, and you're going to have your cartilage erode, and you're going to form spaces. So this section right here, this hypertrophic, if this is my medullary cavity right here, essentially we have to create this medullary cavity. So that will start to break down and form spaces, break down lacunae, enlarge them, erode them, and then create spaces. And then what will happen in the calcification zone is that these spaces in the cartilage matrix will start to calcify and die and deteriorate. So we essentially are going to erode, then we're going to calcify and kill off, and then the last step is we will actually ossify and replace with spongy bone. So all of that to get to this guy right here. So this is the top of your epiphyseal plate. You can see right there how it's, this is the epiphysis side, and this is the diaphysis side of this bone right here. So if you look right here, we've got our resting zone and then our 4 other zones, so 5 total. If you'll notice right here how there is calcification and there is a matrix, essentially there is going to be the actual holes. This is the inside. This is the top end of that medulla. So right now that's what you're kind of seeing. So that's really important and really cool to be able to see how you're going to elongate that medullary cavity. Okay, so as that's going, your epiphyseal plate is actually going to maintain its constant thickness throughout all development. So the plate itself does not change, But what will happen is that as it keeps growing and the cartilage keeps getting replaced, you will essentially at some point have what is called bone closure or epiphyseal plate closure. And that is when the two will actually fuse. So rather than having your epiphyses and your diaphyses separated by this epiphyseal plate, whenever those actually fuse together, you just get this. This will be no more growth. So this is what's going to happen with adults when we no longer have any lengthening to our long bones. This is going to be with any type of bone growth during childhood and adolescence. So essentially the epiphyses and the diaphyses just fuse. Like I said, it does happen at different places for different genders. Females, their diaphysis and epiphysis will actually fuse earlier. So that way around 18 years of age, they stop growing. Whereas males, it's around 21 years of age. So that's why they say men hit their growth spurt a little bit later, but they also technically just stop growing a little later. So everything's just slightly a couple years behind for that one. Okay, so that was growing the length of your bone, but you can also grow bone width. So if you were just to grow the length of your bone from a 2-year-old to a 20-year-old and it maintained its same thickness, if this is your 2-year-old, and you maintain that same thickness as a 20-year-old, you essentially have done this. That does not actually support the entire body. What you need to have is as the bone grows, the thickness of the bone actually grows as well to be able to maintain the entire trunk, body, tissues, everything to be able to protect and support. So bones will actually widen as they lengthen, and this is going to be called appositional growth. So appositional growth is going to be both bone widening. This will continuously happen throughout life. This does not pause with adolescence. It is important because the reason we need this is because if we have a lot of increase in strength, stress from muscle activity, let's say you actually go to the gym and you work out and you are building muscle mass, your bones will actually thicken in response to that muscle mass being increased. Or if you actually do add weight to your overall body, then your bones will actually thicken in response to that. So the way this is going to work is the bone cells we've already talked about. Your osteoblasts will do what they do best, which is secrete bone matrix. And then the osteoclasts will then break down and remove the bone. So essentially, what you're doing is you're building up and breaking down your bone. You're not just adding new. You are building up and then you're breaking down, and this leads to thicker, stronger bones. So you're not just replacing more bone on top of bone. You're actually breaking down and replacing. So here's an example of long bone growth and remodeling. Okay, so what actually controls your bone growth? Postnatal. So what controls your bone growth? There's a primary way your bones are going to be controlled, and that is going to be through a hormonal control. So your hormones are responsible for controlling this entire process. There's a couple hormones we're going to talk about. First one is growth hormone. Growth hormone is exactly what it's called, and it helps grow and stimulate growth, which is really going to stimulate the epiphyseal plate activity. So that's how you're going to get that bone growth, is it's going to stimulate that epiphyseal plate to do what it needs to do. As a reminder, when we talked about the functions of bone, we said that growth hormone was actually stored in the bones. So that's just full circle on how that process works. The next hormone is going to be thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone will also be responsible for helping out our growth hormone. So it will actually modulate it. So that way it makes the growth hormone work correctly in the correct proportions. And then we have a couple other hormones that are responsible for bone growth. They're going to be the reproductive hormones. Your androgens, your estrogen primarily for males, and your estrogen primarily for females. And what these guys are actually going to do for males and females is they're going to happen at puberty, but they're going to end the growth by closing the epiphyseal plate, by triggering that process. So this is how you're going to have essentially the closure, and this is why it makes sense why they're at different rates for male versus female, because they happen under the control of different hormones. Okay, so the next section we're going to talk about is called bone remodeling, and this is a very cool process. So bone remodeling is different than bone development or bone growth, as I spell that out. Bone remodeling. So what bone remodeling is this will actually occur just to replace your bone mass. So it will actually recycle your bone mass. Essentially, you'll replace 75% of your bone mass every week. So everyone is probably familiar with your skin being able to, or needing to have a new layer of skin, because it will get sloughed off, it'll get scraped off, but you need to have that replacement of your external skin. You also need to replace your bone, and just to make sure that it is super, super strong. So bone remodeling is a process of recycling your bone. You're going to break down the old and add in new, just to make sure it's super, super, super strong. So this means if we have spongy bone replaced about every 3 to 4 years, our entire skeleton, our compact bone, and our spongy bone will be finished every 10 years. So about every 10 years, you have a new skeleton from what you had before. So bone remodeling has 2 steps. And these 2 steps are going to be, first, bone resorption, and then bone deposit. I know it is out of order from what the slide says, but I find it easier to talk about them in this order. So with bone resorption, we're going to talk about that first. This will occur both on the periosteum and the endosteum. So it's going to be on inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. And these are the 2 cells we're going to talk about a lot, osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So make sure you know those guys. So first step, bone resorption. So bone resorption is going to be primarily responsible for being completed by your osteoclasts. So whenever you think of resorption, osteoclasts. So as a reminder, osteoclasts break down things. So what these are technically doing with bone resorption is they are actually breaking down your bone. So that's in a nutshell what these guys are actually doing for bone resorption. The way they are doing it is because they are actually secreting an enzyme that is acidic. And the acidic nature of the enzyme will actually convert the salt to a soluble form that can be dissolved by water. So essentially they are going to release an acid, and the acid will break down the bone. Specifically the calcium salt, which gives the bone its hardness. So that's really important. So just remember, bone resorption is osteoclasts. After the osteoclasts break down everything, they're then going to phagocytize and essentially eat up and get rid of all of the destroyed mineral matrix and all of the dead osteocytes. So it's going to digest everything. So once it happens, this digestion is what is called resorption. So the digestion is essentially going to be this resorption concept right now. So if it's helpful to think about that, go for it. But once this digestion of everything is complete, your osteoclasts are destroyed. So at the whole end of the whole process, your osteoclasts will undergo apoptosis, which means that they will destroy themselves. And as they undergo apoptosis, they will then trigger the next part of the process. So resorption is breaking down the bone. It's done by osteoclasts. When it's done, they destroy themselves. This whole process is going to involve parathyroid and immune T cell properties. So these are going to be important. So it'll be done with parathyroid hormone and with T cell proteins will be responsible for making this process work. So that's important to note. Okay, then the step 2 is now that we've broken down part of the bone, we have to lay down new bone. Essentially, we broke up the highway, now we have to lay down the new highway. So bone matrix is going to be deposited by osteoblasts. So the first one was clasts, this one is blasts. Remember, the blasts are the ones that secrete the osteoid. So at this point, your bone deposit is going to be done by osteoblasts, and they will essentially just go through a process that will lay down new bone. So there'll be a new area of matrix that will actually be put together. The connection between the old and the new is going to be the osteoid seam. And then that calcification front is going to be that transition point from the osteoid seam to the old bone. So bone deposit is laying down new bone because the osteoblast will secrete the matrix outside and essentially harden. So that is what's happening with bone deposit. So some things that's happening with bone deposit. It may be triggered. The reason we might have this happen is because a couple things. Science is still trying to figure all this out. But bone deposit may happen because mechanical signals. There's increased levels of stress. There's going to be increased concentration of minerals that need to be actually laid down. Matrix proteins that need to be bound, or an appropriate amount of enzymes. So why bone deposit may or may not occur may be related to these things. Okay, so when we actually control our bone growth, we talked about hormones like growth hormone, thyroid hormone, and then the androgens of testosterone and estrogen, but there's also a control of modeling. So there's a process of hormones as well that will control our remodeling process of resorption and deposit. So the first way that you'll have control of remodeling is going to be hormones. So just like bone growth, hormones are going to control this. But it's different, and it's a much more complicated process than the one before. So some of the hormones that are controlling the process of remodeling are going to be related to calcium. Calcium is a big one. So how calcium actually relates or controls your hormonal levels, it is a negative feedback cycle. So the negative feedback cycle is something that we have talked a lot about in our chapter 1. It came up on exams, so just make sure you're always keeping that process in the back of your head. So we're going to go through that process in a second. But negative feedback loop is going to control calcium levels, and this is really going to be around the reason we have this calcium. It's responsible in many processes, but really this is going to be for about 99% of the calcium you have in your body is going to be found in the bone. So that's actually really, really, really important. So your hormonal control is going to be responsible with blood calcium levels. What controls your blood calcium level are going to be these two guys right here. So this is my feedback cycle. So remember, a negative feedback cycle is going to do a opposite. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that seesaw in the middle. So how you actually have your calcium levels controlled are going to be by the hormone parathyroid. So the hormone control is going to be primarily through the parathyroid hormone. And what this will do is it will control blood calcium levels. So hormonal controls will actually regulate the blood calcium levels, and it's going to be parathyroid hormone. So we're going to draw a negative feedback cycle. So here we go. Here's an example of a negative feedback cycle. The first thing you're going to have is your stimulus. So our stimulus is going to be a decrease of calcium in the blood. If I have a decrease of calcium, what I'm going to have, the next step, is I will have my parathyroid hormone, PTH, will be released. And it is going to be released from the parathyroid gland. So this will live in your throat. And when you have a decrease in calcium levels in your blood, your parathyroid hormone is released. If I release a hormone, guess what it's going to do? It's going to increase the levels of parathyroid in my blood. Because we just released it, it'll go up. Parathyroid hormones are very, very cool. Because what parathyroids do is they will actually cause your osteoclasts to work. So if I increase the level of parathyroid hormone in my blood, my response that I'm going to get from these guys is going to be my osteoclasts will degrade or resorb the bone. And as it does that, it will release that calcium into the blood. So if my osteoclasts degrade and start to resorb and break down bone, it'll release calcium into the blood. What will my calcium levels do? My calcium levels will increase in my blood. So this process started with a decrease in calcium levels and ended with an increase of calcium levels, all because by releasing parathyroid hormone, I'm going to start degrading my bone and getting that mineral out. So this is a really cool process. What you need to know about this is a stimulus of decreased calcium in the blood. So that is the stimulus right there. What I want you to be able to do is do the stimulus. What if there's an increase of calcium in the blood? What process happens there? This is what I want you guys to be able to do, because it's a negative feedback cycle, which means if the blood levels go down, they can also go up. But what happens if we have too high of calcium levels? Then you have to go through a process and be able to figure that out. So go through and look at that, because that's going to be helpful information for you to know. Okay, another hormone that is responsible for controlling bone remodeling is going to be this calcitonin hormone. And calcitonin is something that we're still trying to figure out exactly how it does, but it will also be responsible for blood calcium levels. So we do know both of these are going to be responsible for calcium levels. So one thing to keep in mind is there's some issues if we increase our calcium levels too much. And this is going to be homeostatic imbalance. So now that we're into the systems of the body, we're going to start talking through what happens when they go wrong. So what happens if you have hypocalcemia? So this is going to be low calcium. It can cause hyperexcitability of your muscles. What happens if you have hypercalcemia? This is going to be high. Hypo is always going to be low. Hyper is always going to be high calcium. You can actually cause your muscles to not respond at all because there's too much. So just because calcium is great and we need it, you can have too much and you can have too little. So you need to have the piece right in the middle. There's two more hormones that are going to be controlling this whole process. And just to briefly run through those, one is leptin and one is serotonin. And leptin is released by adipose tissue, and serotonin is going to be a neurotransmitter that regulates mood and sleep. Both of these are going to play a role in bone density. So you just need to know that there are 4 total hormones: parathyroid hormone, calcitonin, but also leptin and serotonin that do control remodeling of bone. But there's a second way that you can control remodeling, and that's going to be mechanical stress. So mechanical stress essentially means your bone will need to remodel because something is telling it that it needs to, because there's some sort of stress that is put on it. Basically, bones will reflect the stress that they actually encounter. So if you were to pull down on one end of a bone, it would bend. That's what happens, and that's what we're talking about with stress. So there's this gentleman named Wolf who came up with a law, and his law is going to be called Wolff's Law. And Wolff's law is that the bone will actually grow or it will remodel in response to stress. So it will affect whatever affects it, it will actually change the bone itself. So some examples of Wolff's law is going to be stress will tend and break, and they will actually compress on one side. So this is a very interesting part right here. So when we said that they will actually bend, this is the natural point of tension. You'll notice that the bones actually look like this. They don't just look like this. So this is going to be the connection between your hip and your upper leg, your femur and your hip bone. So it's not just up and down like this. It actually has to do this bend right here in order to get the stress because of the entire weight of the body resting on that one joint. So Wolff's law is actually really cool because it explains handedness. The right or the left-handed, whichever one you typically use to write with, that hand will have a thicker and stronger bone. That arm will have a thicker and stronger bone because you're using it more. Wherever you're going to have bones that are going to be likely to buckle, they will be thicker in that particular place. So if I have a bone that is likely to buckle, that is a very bad bone. Let's try that again. If I have a bone that will be likely to buckle right here, what you'll actually have is the bone will bump out and be slightly thicker in that space. You'll have trabeculae form along lines of stress. And then whenever you have places where large, heavy muscles attach, you'll actually have little projections for them to anchor onto. And what's interesting is that bones of fetus and bones of people who are in nursing homes who don't have the ability to get up out of bed or are bedridden are considered featureless. There is no bumps, there is no thickness. They are smooth because there is actually no stress being put on them. So it's an interesting way that we know that Wolff's law actually does occur. Okay, so then the last section that we're going to focus on is going to be what happens when your bones go wrong. So that's going to be bone repair. So you've got bone growth during development. Well, first of all, you've got bone formation during development. Then you've got bone growth during adolescent. And then you've got bone remodeling that occurs just during life in order to replace and break down and give you new bone. But what happens if you actually damage the bone? Then you have to repair the bone. And so that's what this section is going to be covering. So fractures are breaks. So whenever you hear the term fracture, it means the bone has broken. We can classify fracture a couple different ways. So when we actually classify fractures, the first way we're actually going to classify them is based on the position of the bone ends. So it's going to be the position of the epiphyses. And what we mean by the position of the epiphyses is, are they in their normal position or are they out of their normal position? So this is going to be non-displaced or displaced. So if we have a non-displaced fracture, then the bone end is in its typical spot. What we mean by that is that the end of the bone is still connected and in the same organizational structure that it should be. It has not moved out of the socket. Or you can have displaced, which is where you have essentially just broken it and it has moved completely and it's no longer in alignment with the next bone. Or we can classify fractures based on the completeness of the break. Essentially, how good were you at breaking the bone? If we break it and it's complete, the bone was broken essentially all the way through. So that means you sliced that bone all the way through. So this is my bone. You've sliced it like that. It is going to be broken all the way through. Whereas if you have an incomplete bone, this is only breaking a bone halfway through. So this is going to be where you essentially have gone halfway, but you haven't gone all the way through. And then you can also classify a break whether or not it goes through the skin. And if it goes through the skin, it's going to involve a lot more external blood. That would be an open, or sometimes called a compound fracture. Means that it has gone all the way through the skin. Or you can have a closed, sometimes called a simple fracture, which means it is still within the skin and is intact. So here's some examples of some types of fractures. So common types of fractures that we're going to have. We're going to run through these real quick. So this is how you're going to classify the bone ends, the completeness, and whether the skin is penetrated, but you can also just look at the external structure of the, there's a couple other things. So these are going to be common fracture types. You can have comminuted. This is essentially going to be where you have more than three or more places that you have broken it. You can have a compression, which is essentially you've pressed the bone and it's crushed. This will happen in vertebrae a lot of the time. You can have a spiral, which was done because there was a great twist that was put to it, so it actually breaks on the diagonal. You can have the epiphyseal break, which essentially just means it breaks right across the top of that epiphyseal plate, and it just breaks right down that spot right there. Or you can have a depressed fracture, which means that it is going to press inward, kind of like if you were going to hit something, it would make an indentation. Or you can have a green stick fracture, and this is going to be the bone that does not break completely. So if you ever have lived in the South and have gone outside and pulled a twig that still is green or fresh or new growth, and you try to bend it in half, it doesn't snap in half completely. It'll actually bend with you, and that's called a green stick because it doesn't break completely. It will bend. That's kind of what happens with this green stick fracture. Okay, so I'm not going to cover what happens with repairing a fracture, but essentially what you're going to have to just do is create new bone, and it's going to happen through your intervention of your blood supply. But we're not going to specifically talk about that, nor is it going to be on the exam. So the last section I do want to talk about is going to be what happens when all of this goes horribly, horribly wrong. These are bone disorders. So like every part of the next couple of chapters, we're going to talk about diagnoses or things where things will actually go wrong. Bone disorders are going to be an imbalance between the processes. Usually bone deposit and bone resorption are going to underlie nearly every disease on the human skeleton. So the three major bone diseases that we're going to talk about: osteomalacia, osteoporosis, and Paget's disease. So first off, osteomalacia. You may have also heard this called rickets, but that is going to be specifically just in children. So the overarching diagnosis is osteomalacia. And these are going to be bones that are poorly mineralized. So there's not a lot of hard calcium phosphate in order to make them a very hard bone. So they're poorly mineralized. So what's happening with this is the osteoid is produced. So you will actually have the structure in place. But what will actually happen is that the calcium salts are not adequate. So you will be doing what you should be doing, but it's not doing it with the right amount of salt, right amount of calcium salt. So what you'll actually end up with is something called soft bones. You just do not have enough of the calcium salts in order to make it hard. So what you're going to see is the symptom of this is actually going to be pain when you actually apply weight to the bone because the bone is soft. So it'll be pain with weight bearing. That is going to be the primary symptom that you will see. So all of this for osteomalacia you need to know. But for rickets, whenever it's osteomalacia in children, the same process applies. except what it is, since it's specifically in children, this is going to affect growth a little bit. So what you'll actually see is bone deformities and bowed legs. So I don't know if there's a picture. There is not. So if I had a sweet little kiddo who should have hips who look like this, what you'll actually get with these soft bones is you will get bones that look like this. And the reason is because all of their body weight is pushing down on these bones, these femurs that are soft and not adequately able to support it. So they'll bend outward because of stress. Wolf's Law in action. So that's going to be rickets. It's the same thing, it's just going to cause bone deformities. So the primary thing that you'll see kids were diagnosed with rickets in 50s and 60s is because they had the bowed legs. So the next one we're going to talk about is osteoporosis. And so osteoporosis is probably one of the most common, and it's actually a group of diseases. But what is happening with osteoporosis is bone resorption. So the taking up of old bone will actually exceed bone deposit. So the ability to break down your bones is greater than laying down new bone. So what you'll actually get is bones are going to be, the composition of the bones is going to be fine. So your bone mineral composition is totally appropriate. However, what it is it will actually decrease the bone mass. So you've broken down a bunch of bone, but you have not replaced it. So that's what we mean by bone mass. So it's going to be essentially bone resorption is exceeding bone deposit. You're going to get kind of a spongy, very, very light bones is what these are called. But not only will you have light bones, you will have porous bones. This is what is known as osteoporosis when you look at the microscope. So this is what you see right here with all of the little holes in these pieces. So some risk factors for osteoporosis is going to be usually female, most often postmenopausal women. It usually affects 30% of women around age 60, and then that increases by age 80 to 70%. But estrogen does play a role, so that will come into play with hormones and all the bone deposit pieces. Okay, so that's osteoporosis. Some additional risk factors are everyday life through smoking or poor diet where you don't have enough minerals of calcium and protein, insufficient exercise, but then also some things like genetics, hormone-related conditions, and consumption of alcohol. And there's how we treat it. You can do it a couple different ways based on the severity. I'm not going to focus on the drugs for osteoporosis, but what I want to get to is Paget's disease. So we had osteomalacia, osteoporosis, and now Paget's disease. So Paget's disease is where you are actually going to have excessive bone deposit and resorption. So this is going to be a little bit different. So you will actually have both. You will have excessive bone deposit, so you're laying down a lot of bone, but you're also going to have excessive resorption. So essentially you're doing the normal process, but you're just doing it on hyper speed. So this is actually going to be, it's just a fast process. So what you're going to get is you are going to have poorly developed bones, because essentially the process happened too quick. They have not been able to develop correctly. And really the reason you're going to have poorly developed bones is because there will be a high ratio of spongy to compact bone. So it's not going to be the normal ratio that you're going to have with this Paget's disease. So a high ratio. This is usually going to occur in your spine, your pelvis, your femur, or your skull, and it rarely happens before 40. But you can see this right here is Paget's disease, where you're having your normal everyday process. It kind of looks like osteoporosis underneath the microscope, but there's the ratio of spongy to compact bone is what they're looking for, not holes in the bone, which would be what they're looking for with osteoporosis. So when you're reviewing these three diseases, osteomalacia, osteoporosis, and Paget's disease, know the relationship between the bone remodeling and the bone resorption for each of these sections. As we're going through with development of your bone, we've already talked about most of this, but at birth, most long bones are ossified except for the epiphyses. This will continue with the epiphyseal plate doing its thing through childhood and adolescent, and then females and males will close off and ossify that epiphyseal plate at different ages, but by age 25, skeletal growth should actually decrease. So this is a really cool image to be able to show you the skeletal bones versus the cartilage. So this is week 10. So at week 10, we said at week 9, you were starting to ossify and replace the bone, replace the cartilage across all of your bones. So you'll actually can see, if you look right here on the hand, these bones right here that are in the palm have been replaced by bone. However, the connection point right here, the ends of the bone, and the ends of the bone right here are still cartilage. Cartilage is mainly made up of water. So that's why in a image like this, you can see through things that are made of water, so they look clear, where you can't see through harder structures like bone. So another place that's really good to see it is the femur right here. You can actually see this right here is going to be the actual diaphysis, but what you are lacking right here is there is no hardened epiphysis. So you can actually see straight through the ends of the bones because they are still cartilage and will continue to be cartilage up until birth. So that's going to be the wrapping up this last section of chapter 6.